Alright guys, welcome back to Underground Science, and in this video we'll be doing a quick overview of conjugate acids and conjugate bases. Alright, so make sure to go and check out my Bronsted-Lowry acid and Bronsted-Lowry base videos because it's pretty much related to that. Alright, so hopefully it shouldn't be too long of a video, alright? It should be a quick video, just a quick overview. So let's go ahead and see what happens when we react hydrochloric acid, which is one of our strong acids, with water. Alright, so hydrochloric acid plus water will yield. Now remember, we'll just go over it soon right now, so let me just go and write out the reaction. We're going to have our hydronium cation, which tells us that we're in an acidic solution, and our chloride anion. Alright, so let's go and look at this example first. Let me go ahead and erase this nitric acid example, right? We'll just go over two examples. So nitric acid, I'm going to write it down here, and let's go and discuss this first. So remember that our Bronsted-Lowry acid is an acid that will donate a hydrogen cation. So we see that HCl is our Bronsted-Lowry acid because our hydrogen cation is donated to H2O, turning H2O into H3O plus right here, right? And when we do donate, right, when we do donate our hydrogen cation, we only have chloride, we have our chloride anion because the hydrogen cation leaves an electron, right? Because remember we saw that our Lewis dot structure for HCl was like so. So we had Cl here, and we had 7 valence electrons for Cl, so 2, 4, 6, 7. And remember this formed a covalent bond, right? We share electrons to form a bond. It's called a covalent bond. But what happens in a Bronsted-Lowry acid is that this hydrogen atom, right, is taken as a whole and is actually donated to our H2O. So what happens here is that because our hydrogen atom does not take its electron that it had that helped bond itself with Cl, it does not take that electron. So if it's not taking one extra electron, the hydrogen cation, it's going to become a hydrogen cation, right? Because it doesn't have its electron anymore that it had. It only has one electron. If it doesn't have that, it's basically a proton, right? So what's going to happen is that this hydrogen cation is then going to, I'm going to try to erase this the best I can, it's fine, is then going to be a hydrogen cation that's going to join with H2O, turning into H3O plus. Now what happens here is that we're left with an extra electron. Usually we had chlorine, right, which was neutral, right? But now we don't have chlorine, we have our chloride anion because we have an extra electron here that hydrogen left behind. All right, so which ends up being this. So we donate a hydrogen cation, making our HCl the Bronsted-Lowry acid. So our HCl is the Bronsted-Lowry acid, and it's also the Lewis acid, but we won't get into that in this video because we discussed the same example in our Lewis acid Lewis base video, so go and check that out. All right, Bronsted-Lowry acid, and because H2O accepts that hydrogen cation, a base that accepts a hydrogen cation is called a Bronsted-Lowry base, right? A compound that accepts a hydrogen cation is called a Bronsted-Lowry base. All right. So this was a quick review of our video that we made for Bronsted-Lowry acid and base, right? So what about conjugate acid and conjugate base? Well, we see here that when we lost the hydrogen cation, right, we got a chloride anion. So for this strong acid, our conjugate base would be the chloride anion, because the conjugate base can similarly it could also gain a hydrogen cation from this extra hydrogen cation hydronium and become HCl, right? It's not common because in this particular reaction, because HCl is a strong acid, so it'll dissociate fully. But the way to think about it is that if you know that a Bronsted-Lowry acid will donate a hydrogen cation, you can also think of it as the same way when you're trying to identify a conjugate acid or conjugate base. All right, I mean, right away you could probably tell that this is the conjugate base and this is the conjugate acid because this has an extra hydrogen cation, this has one less hydrogen cation, right? But a way to tell, like the way I use, is that if you know that a Bronsted-Lowry acid is a compound that will donate a hydrogen cation, A conjugate acid, you can think about it as that a conjugate acid can also, like in this example, can also donate a hydrogen cation, making chloride anion turn into hydrochloric acid, right? So you could think of it as the same exact way. If the Bronson-Lowry base can accept a hydrogen cation, right? That's the definition, right? So a conjugate base can also accept a hydrogen cation. So if you want, you can think of it like that, but you should know that if we have an extra, usually if we have an extra hydrogen cation, that's our conjugate acid, right? And if we have one less hydrogen cation, that's our conjugate base. Because just know that we went from an acid to a conjugate base. All right, so we went from a strong acid to a very, very, very weak conjugate base. All right, so, or you can think of it as just remember Bronson-Lowry acid and Bronson-Lowry base, and think of it as the same way when you're trying to identify the conjugate acid and conjugate base. So again, if the Bronson-Lowry acid definition is that a compound that donates a hydrogen cation, then what's the conjugate acid? We'll just think of it as the same exact definition. What will be the conjugate acid here? Well, what will, in quotes, right, donate a hydrogen cation to go back to this form? Well, right here, right, our H2O can donate hydrogen cation to turn the chloride anion into hydrochloric acid. So we know that this is our conjugate acid. All right, and if our Bronson-Lowry base accepts a hydrogen cation, we can think of it as our conjugate base can also, right, accept a hydrogen cation turning into HCl, right? But it's just a way to think about so you can help identify, it can help us identify the conjugate acid and conjugate base. But the reality is that just in a regular acid reaction like this, when we see a strong acid reacting with water, we should know right away that because we lost a hydrogen cation here, this is going to be this is going to be our conjugate base. Because we gained a hydrogen cation here, this is going to be our conjugate acid. All right, but if you use the way of just knowing the definitions of these and applying it to the product side also, you can also identify the conjugate acid and conjugate base. All right, so this can be the conjugate base because it can, in quotes again, accept a hydrogen cation from hydronium. So this is the conjugate base. All right, so that was that example. Let's go and talk about nitric acid. So let's react this with water. All right, now if we react this with water, nitric acid is also a strong acid. So what's going to happen is that we're going to have hydronium and our nitrate anion. All right, so now what's going to happen? Let's go and identify the same thing, but let's be quicker this time because now we know what's happening. The Bronson-Lowry acid is going to be a compound that donates our hydrogen cation. So what we see here is that our nitric acid is the Bronson-Lowry acid. All right, so our nitric acid is the Bronson-Lowry acid. Why is that? Because we're donating this hydrogen cation over to H2O, turning H2O into hydronium. All right, and because H2O is the one that's accepting the hydrogen cation, we know that's a definition of a Bronson-Lowry base. So Bronson-Lowry base. All right, and if it helps you to think about it as the same definition for the conjugate acid and conjugate base, go ahead and think about it like that, right? Because you could still identify it, the correct conjugate acid and conjugate base, using the same general definition of Bronson-Lowry base and Bronson-Lowry acid. So here, if we're trying to identify the conjugate acid, think of what the definition of a Bronson-Lowry acid is: a compound that donates a hydrogen cation. Well, hydronium can donate a hydrogen cation, turning nitrate anion into nitric acid. So that means that our hydronium is the conjugate acid. All right? And also that would mean that, and then so if we're trying to identify the conjugate base, I mean, we know this is the conjugate base, but just to go over the definitions, we can think about what a Bronson-Lowry base is. Bronson-Lowry base is a compound that accepts a hydrogen cation. Well, here, the nitrate anion can accept a hydrogen cation from hydronium and become nitric acid. So here, the nitrate anion will be our conjugate base. All right, so now the nitrate anion will be the conjugate base. So we can see our acid-base pairs here, our acid-conjugate base pairs here. All right, so if we see here, we have nitric acid, nitrate anion. That's one pair. All right, so that's one acid-base pair. Then we have our base and our conjugate acid, right? That's one acid-base pair. And just like that, this is, well, in our future video when we look at buffers, right? How a buffer solution works, we'll need to know conjugate acid-base pairs. All right. So this is pretty much what I wanted to get through when we're talking about conjugate acid and identifying conjugate base. And one extra thing I want to mention is that if the stronger the acid, right, the stronger the Bronsted-Lowry acid, the weaker, right, so let me just go and say the weaker the conjugate base. All right, and we saw this in both the examples. So both of these are strong acids. So especially in HCl, the stronger the acid, right? This is a really strong acid. So that means the conjugate base will be super weak, all right? Because the stronger the acid, the weaker the conjugate base. So this conjugate base is really weak, and it won't really act as a buffer, all right? Which we'll see in a future video. So this is all I want to get through in this video. Hopefully this video made sense to you guys. Make sure to tune into my future videos. We'll talk about more cool topics about biochem, physics, and chem. Don't forget to hit that notification bell, like, and subscribe. See you guys later, and stay safe.